What's up guys, and welcome to another video and the first of my 2019 F1 car reviews. This of course is the Toro Rosso STR14, released in digital form online at this stage, but it does give us a pretty good idea of what the real car will be like when we see it for real in testing in Barcelona just next week. Doesn't look at first glance to be absolutely a groundbreaking car. There are of course some brand new rules for this year which have steered the teams in certain directions, particularly aerodynamically. And each team is going to take a slightly different approach to those. They're going to interpret those rules in a slightly different fashion. I don't think we're going to see wildly different comparisons between each team because the rules are pretty restrictive in most of these areas. But let's take a little look at how Toro Rosso have presented their 2019 Challenger. First of all, if we look at the front wing, now heavily simplified front wing as we know for 2019, just 5 elements now allowed. It's much wider, much simpler, none of the paraphernalia on top, the flick ups and flaps. The end plates on the Toro Rosso, really straight and really simple. We saw on the images that we saw on the Haas car released last week that the Haas has managed to still enable itself to have a little bit of outwash, a little bit of turning out on the front wing end plate, something that's so restricted this year. I didn't know if anybody was going to be able to manage it. The Haas at least has some outwash on that end plate. The Toro Rosso though, very straight, very simple, very restrictive. I think most teams are going to end up with a very similar solution to each other in this respect. This digital render doesn't appear, as far as I can see, and I can't see that clearly, but doesn't appear to show any supports between these, 5 individual elements. The top 3 of those elements, I mean, I can't quite see, but they look unsupported from each other. On the Haas, there was a divider or a support bracket running down here, which they had used to help guide the airflow off towards the rest of the car. Doesn't look at this point, from the pictures that I can see, like Toro Rosso have utilised that kind of solution. 5 individual elements not connected to each other, apart from these bottom 2 connected by the main plane. That means that each of these 5 elements will each generate from the tip of those a vortices which will then be channelled off through the suspension, managed by the barge boards and off towards the rear of the car. Really important vortices coming off the tips, the inboard tips of these wings, because that's what helps to be channelled perhaps round by the barge boards and to help seal the floor, as well as manage that front tyre wake, keeping that away from the critical underbody aerodynamic sections. The foot plate, which I'll show you in a moment, runs the full length from front to back of the end plate. Again, slightly different to the Haas solution, which on the Haas it stopped about 3/4 of the way down, all again just desperately trying to regain some of that outwash effect coming off here, to try and turn away some big vortices coming off here, to try and drag with it the turbulent wake that comes off the back of this spinning tyre. If we can get powerful vortices, as we had last year, spinning out in this direction, it can drag that horribly messy turbulent air from the back of the tyre out and away from the critical elements of the car. That's what we had last year. That's what the really complex front wings and the brake duct areas were all designed to do last year. The rule change for 2019 was all about minimising that, because that massive outwash was part of the problem of cars being able to follow, creating this huge turbulent mess, much wider than the car itself, which hindered other cars in terms of trying to overtake because of the loss of downforce that it experienced. Brake ducts, much simpler. On this particular version, we've just got the one scoop here as the rules now prescribe. Fairly large scoop. That scoop will change in size depending on which racetrack they go to and the cooling requirements of those. But now the airflow going into that scoop has to be directed into the brakes themselves. Cannot be channelled out through the hub, the blown axle that we saw on so many cars previously. Another change for 2019. The nose cone, fairly standard. I'll show you in a moment. It has strakes down the side of here, very similar to the ones we saw on the McLaren and others last year. As we move back, and I've got some other images to show you in a moment, but one of the things you can see from this image that stand out are these 2 vertical strakes outside of the side pod area, just on one horizontal support. To me they look like they're going to flap around quite a lot with vibrations but I'm sure they've thought of that. The other thing is that we've got a really long longitudinal slot down the edge of the floor, and that's something that's become much more commonplace in Formula One over recent years. It's all about taking the airflow that's being pushed around the side pods here and rolling it over through this slot, rolling it over to form another vortex rather, which will help to seal off the floor from the messy turbulent air outside of that. It's trying to seal that channel towards the diffuser. We use a spinning vortex almost as a virtual wall or virtual skirt along the side of the floor to try and seal it in, to channel as much airflow as we can within that floor section and out towards the diffuser to be worked and generate downforce and of course reduce drag. Right, here's a picture from a different angle where you can clearly see this slotted front wing mount on the side of the nose cone. We'll all recognise that. It's nothing new, we've seen it in the past, but it's all about channeling airflow from this centre section of the wing through to the underside of the nose cone, which will then be channelled off through to be worked by the floor and the barge board section. We can't see the entry for it, but I imagine it's just underneath this section here for an S duct, which exits just here, just before the transition between the sloped part of the nose and then the flat part of the chassis. The idea of this S duct here, first of all, it cleans up some of this airflow coming under here, underneath the underside of the car, but more importantly, it channels out some high energy airflow along the top of here, just as if it wasn't there, it would be quite easy for this airflow rising up the slope of the nose to disconnect, to detach itself from the chassis and continue rising, when really what we really want is that to stay attached to the surface of the car. If it stays attached to the surface of the bodywork of the car, we can keep control of it. As an aerodynamicist, when you've got control over the airflow, you're in a much better situation. You can divert it to where you want it to go to. If it detaches, it becomes messy, it starts to spiral into this turbulent mess, which creates drag and is not what we want. Here we can see this foot plate, as I said, on the side of the end plate, running all the way from front to rear. The Haas version stopped about here in an attempt to try and spin up a vortex that might then be spun out by that slight kink at the back of the end plate and pull some of that wake away from the spinning front wheels. We don't have that on this Red Bull. It may well be that that's going to be an area of development. Not much development allowed, not much area for innovation, but because it's a new area, because it's a new regulation, we will see that starting to gain in terms of momentum, in terms of development momentum over the first tests and first few races. I'm sure lots of teams will start to experiment with different solutions. This to me looks very, very simplistic at this stage, and it may well change even by the time we get the car on track next week in Barcelona. Okay, looking at the side view then, you can just about see here the exit for that S duct that I'm talking about. Again, trying to keep that airflow attached along the top of the bodywork, the top of the chassis section here. Nothing groundbreaking around the halo section in terms of ducting. We have got this newer barge board, much lower and much further forward than we had previously, and much simpler. In fact, ironically, one of the reasons we've done this within Formula One was actually driven by the fact that teams wanted to clear up this space to allow sponsors to have a clear, unobstructed view of the side of the chassis. Except the Toro Rosso still has nothing in that space at all. Down here then, the barge board, as I say, relatively simple, collecting lots of this airflow, passing through the suspension, passing off through that section of the front wing and nose cone that I talked about, collecting this big vortices, the Y250 vortex that we talk about coming off the inboard tips of the front wing planes, will be picked up by this barge board here. It's often called a deflector for the very reason that it deflects that vortex out and away from these sensitive areas of the car here. So the big powerful vortex coming off the wingtips will be picked up by this, sent spiralling outwards. And again, last year it was used to drag away this horrible, messy tyre wake away from the other areas of the car where we really don't want it. That will be doing the same sort of thing, just less powerful this time because of this smaller, much more simplistic take that we've had to adopt in that area of the car. The long longitudinal strake running along the floor, we can't really see it in this section, but it's taking airflow that's being channeled around the inside of this bodywork, heavily sculpted bodywork and side pods on this Toro Rosso. Quite nice in its form factor. All designed to push the airflow down and around this floor section here. Some of it, as I said, being channeled through this longitudinal slot to help seal up the floor. The rest of it being forced around through this big overhang really pronounced overhang in the bodywork, pushing that airflow down towards what we call the Coke bottle area. Called that because if you look at the car from overhead, it looks like the shape, the neck of a Coke bottle, dramatically slimming in, pushing airflow in here to help the diffuser become far more powerful. So as much airflow as we can get in there, the better, and that is exactly why we've got this big curled over section of bodywork here to try and drive as much of that in through there as we possibly can. Very similar in terms of engine covers, no winglets at this point, no flick-ups on that section that we may have seen in others. What seems to be becoming quite common at this point is a number of vertical strakes on this now bigger, wider, longer and deeper rear wing. Much simpler, of course, nothing allowed now in this area where we used to have a number of louvers to help spill off some of that airflow pressure coming off the top of the rear wing there, trying to minimise the drag coming off that, to clean up the airflow that exits that front wing. We're not allowed to do that in that area anymore, but these strakes down here all help to smooth the airflow coming off the back of the car. Lots of people say to me, why do we need to worry about airflow that's already left the car? Well, if we have huge, messy, draggy turbulence coming off the back of the car, yes, that airflow's already passed over the car, but it then becomes directly in the path of any other airflow passing over the car. So we need to clean up as much as we can, push away the turbulence and the drag creating vortices off the back of the car to smooth the path for the oncoming airflow that's now passing over the car, if you understand what I mean. So it's not just about what the airflow does at the point of the bodywork itself, also we care very much about what happens to it once it's passed over and left the car itself. Okay, something that's become very common, very popular now in Formula One is this very high side pod inlet. We've got these on the Toro Rosso. Again, it means that the crash structures, the side impact crash structures on the car have to be mounted further down, but in doing so they allow the air intake to be pushed up as high as possible into the free stream air passing through and over some of this front suspension here, to allow as much as we can get into the cooling parts of the car for oil coolers, water coolers, but crucially allowing as much air to pass underneath it and channeled around here towards this crucial area at the back of the car and the car's floor. We can just about see here that the Honda power unit, in this particular instance at least, has the two wastegate pipes situated just to the side and down underneath the exhaust centre tailpipe, a centre pillar on the front wing, all there to try and minimise any turbulence, any drag. Relatively standard looking rear suspension arrangement and front suspension arrangement. This is a car that's taken an awful lot, including many of those suspension elements, from the Red Bull. A new collaboration this year, a little bit in the realms of the Haas-Ferrari relationship, where lots of the non-listed parts will be taken from Red Bull, purchased in, if you like, and used on the Toro Rosso. So we might be able to see some of these elements on this car being carried through to the 2019 Red Bull racing car that we'll see later this week. One of the new rules is concerning wing mirrors, which now push the wing mirrors much further out. The idea being to enable the drivers to see past the rear wing. The rear wing was also raised up higher for a very similar reason, to increase the rearwards visibility for the drivers in the mirrors. But what it's meant is that to enable the wing mirrors to come out much further, much wider, we are now allowing teams to have this big horizontal strake or stay. The teams will say it's all there for stability, but it would be silly to not to assume that it's going to give some kind of aerodynamic benefit in terms of controlling airflow, pushing airflow down on top of this side pod, which will then be worked by the rest of the surfaces. But at the moment, nice looking, fairly simple, fairly clean. But there it is, the brand new Toro Rosso STR14. What do you think? Loads more to come this week, of course. We'll see it for real on track next week in Barcelona. Will that Honda power unit deliver something that's going to be reliable and fast to give both Red Bull Racing and Toro Rosso a proper chance to fight this year?